You helped write Russell Simmons' autobiography in 2001. Did that experience get you thinking about writing about your own life?
Well, that was funny because I've known Russell since I believe 77 or 78. So our lives are in terms of we both were like struggling guys starting out in the outer boroughs, and it was fun. But I was thinking a lot about these different stories of people I've known a long time, and how the city of New York was such an integral part of Russell's life, my life. We're actually we're born a year apart. A month apart. So we're really around the same age. I met Spike Lee before while he was making She's Gonna Have It, who's about my age. So this idea that New York was a place where certain kinds of working class black people could come up through the ranks, be creative, and make a mark in the world. That really did strike me about both their stories. And I saw, it played a role, definitely, in thinking about me telling my story.
Well, you're a journalist, so were you doing an investigative report on your own life?
Writing about myself is the most difficult thing I probably have ever done.
It's easier to write about somebody else?
Absolutely. It's funny. I've worked with the same editor now for almost 20 years, Wendy Wolf. And from the Deaf Rhythm and Blues in '88 all the way to now. And she kept telling me, okay, enough about this, enough sociology, enough whatever. Let's get back. Where are you in the story? So it was difficult. And I directed a film for HBO called Life Support that came out in 2007. And it wasn't really until I did that film that I was able to finish the book. Because in a sense, I knew what I wanted to say about growing up in Brooklyn. I knew what I wanted to say about the kind of life living in New York in this very artistic world of the 70s and 80s. But I didn't have an ending. I don't know where this led me, ultimately. And doing this film, which has these threads of my family story, writing, obviously, cinema, and Brooklyn, that film, once I did that, I felt like that's a nice endpoint for this journey. My mother's journey, my family's journey, is a very typical. They both came from Newport News, Virginia. My father came up here after the Korean War, got a job at the post office in the GI Bill, moved to public housing. We were one of the first families in the Samuel J. Tilden houses when it opened, which was like around 61, I think. So that's a pretty typical journey. And as the earlier speaker had talked about, public housing and how black families ended up in there. And the fact that my family broke up. One of the things I looked at when I was researching the book was the kind of the history of black families, single-parent families. And, there was this tremendous upshoot in the number of single-parent black families starting around 1960. I'm not enough a sociologist to speak about all the reasons for that, but certainly I was part of that, and I was a product of that world. My mother was an incredible, strong-willed woman. I call her my Cicely Tyson. And, she started as an AP. She was working at an A&P supermarket, something people probably don't even remember anymore, and worked her way all the way up to get a master's in education and become an assistant principal. And during that journey, she pulled us out of the projects. What was interesting about her is that she went to night school at Brooklyn College, and she would bring home these books. And so I remember Hemingway's In Our Time, The Great Gatsby, James Joyce's Dubliners. So along with things like Richard Wright's Native Son, Down These Mean Streets by Perry Thomas, Man Child of Promised Land by Claude Brown, I had this other balance of literature. Those two things, reading Hemingway, reading Fitzgerald, and listening to soul records, listening to Motown, Stax, because I was that kid who would look at the label, and I knew that the light blue cover was Stax from Memphis, and I knew that the blue and white one with the red star was Motown. And so the idea that both literature and music gave me was that there's this world outside of Brooklyn.
But you also say that Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman was the first record you asked your mother to purchase for you. That must have been considered an odd choice for a black kid growing up in the projects. And you also say you had a soft spot for Mary Poppins.
Oh, yeah, Mary Poppins. I never forget going to see it at Radio City Music Hall and singing Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. I think one of the things that's interesting, and what I tried to really look at in the book, is when someone says someone's a black author, or a black anything, or African-American anything, they tend to be, well, this is what they must be into. But the truth is, American life is much more complicated. There's so many influences that make you an American. And for me, it was all of these things. I always identify with my Southern roots, my Brooklyn roots. But the world is bigger than that. And these outside influences allowed me to see myself not simply as a product of a place, but as a citizen of the world.
You say you also were really in love with Captain America and Marvel Comics in general.
Yeah.
And read a lot of liner notes from albums?
Yeah. Well, I'd read, I was kind of inquisitive, but the two things kind of go hand in hand. The comic book thing is I was part of a comic book crew. I remember the last white kid that I remember living in the Tilden projects was part of the comic book trading world. And we went to visit him, and I remember we knocked on his door, and he was very nervous. And I think at that point, his family was getting ready to leave. But comic books was one of my first connections to this world of white and black pop culture, where if you're a nerd and you're into comic books, it didn't matter what color you were. It just you knew about Captain America, Spider-Man, etc.
Did being a nerd put you in any danger with the kids who picked on nerds? I mean, this wouldn't matter whether you're growing up in Brownsville or anywhere else in the world.
Well, as time went on, I became more aware of that. When I was, 10 years old, 11 years old, we played basketball all day. We played stickball. We played all of those New York City games that we'd inherited from the Italians and Jews. We played Skelly. We played Ringo Livio. And these are games that, have sort of disappeared from the city, but we still played those into the 60s. When heroin came in, and I remember vividly, like in the late 60s, it was like a black light went out, and, junkies were on the corner, and the level of fear rose up in the city. That's when it began to become more aware, as a nerd, I guess, of the dangers. And I retreated more and more to my house.
And to reading. Did
Yes.
you think the comic books played a part in your interest in reading and writing ultimately?
Well, absolutely. I mean, my vocabulary, retro rockets. I mean, all kinds of quasi-mystical stuff that was in Avengers comic books. They were a huge, huge part of my life. In fact, one of the things I'm angry at my mother for now is that she tossed out, at a certain point, there was time for them to go, man, I had them all.
Join the human race. Every person I know complains that their mother threw out their comic book collection, and they were worth a lot.
Oh, yeah.
I had the original Spider-Man.
Exactly.
Is probably the most the complaint you hear most often.